Well, millions of Americans are under mandatory evacuation orders as Hurricane Dorian approaches the United States. The Category 4 storm came to a standstill earlier on Monday over Grand Bahama Island, but it's slowly making its way to the southeast coast of the U.S. 5 states, Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Virginia, have declared states of emergency. Hurricane Dorian is expected to approach Florida on Tuesday. Well, to find out where Hurricane Dorian may be heading, I'm joined by Bob Henson live from Atlanta. Bob is a meteorologist and climate writer for the weather company, the owner of weather.com and Weather Underground. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much.
So looking at the predictions so far about the strength of Dorian, what makes this different from other hurricanes or storms that we've had so far this year?
Well, as was just mentioned, it's the strongest hurricane to make landfall in the Atlantic in almost 100 years. And it's exceptionally slow moving right now. It's essentially trying to find its steering current, and it may take another day or so before it finds it. And then it will be rolling up the southeast coast of the U.S., very much like Hurricane Matthew in 2016. So we have some feel for what kind of impacts it might have once it finally gets going. But the impacts in the Bahamas are close to unprecedented. It's just a terrible, terrible calamity there.
And you mentioned this sort of holding pattern that the hurricane is in almost at a standstill. What does that actually do in terms of the damage that's done, and how much do we know about the damage in the Bahamas?
We know very little right now because it's so hard to get information out of there. You know, people have tried when they're in the eye wall, or in the eye rather, to get information out, but it's rather sketchy, and you only have a limited amount of time in most cases before the hurricane winds come at you from the other direction. So it's been really difficult to get information. It's probably going to take, I'm guessing, another day or two at least to get a fuller sense, but I fear there's going to be quite a death toll and certainly a damage toll, because when you slam hurricane winds against buildings just for a couple of hours, that's bad enough, but some locations have been in the eye wall of the storm for close to a day in some places. So it's just going to be an unimaginable amount of property damage, and especially on Grand Bahama Island, and perhaps on parts of Great Abaco Island as well.
And we know the storm is bound for the U.S. How many people potentially could be affected in the U.S.?
Well, we're already seeing widespread evacuations all the way from Florida up to parts of the Carolinas. We're going to see hurricane warnings go up the coastline. They already extend across parts of Florida, and hurricane watches up to South Carolina. Over the next several days, those are going to most likely extend all the way up to North Carolina. So we're going to have probably on the order of a few million people who will have to leave coastal homes. Now, that alone is an economic impact. You know, it's been estimated that an evacuation costs about $1 million a mile, and we're talking perhaps 300, 400, 500 miles might be under warnings. There's going to be a lot of water pushed against the coast, so I think probably the biggest damage from this storm in the United States will be from storm surge and high water pushed against the coastline.
Now, we know it's been about 14 years since Katrina, 7 years since Sandy. How would you rate disaster preparedness in the U.S. since then?
I think there's been a lot of progress. I think, unfortunately, we've learned by experience and had to deal with so many intense storms, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years. I think we've learned a lot about how to get out of harm's way, which is really good, and learned how to prepare for things like power being out for several days. Not everybody has the resources to evacuate, though, and I think that's a particular problem. It's one thing to know you need to leave. It's another to have the wherewithal to get out of there and to have a place to go. And I think that's something we need to think about and address well, especially when folks have pets, because there's still many shelters that don't accept pets. And if you have a loved one that's a pet, you're not going to want to just leave it behind.
And it can certainly be a tough decision to leave your home and your business behind, not knowing what you're going to come back to, or even whether it's going to be looted. What's your advice for people potentially in the storm's path?
Well, people should get out if they're in the evacuation zone, and local authorities are the ones to look to for that. If you're in especially a mandatory evacuation, you really need to get out of there and just secure your home as best you can and get back to it when you can. And in most cases, everybody else will be gone too. And so hopefully that will minimize looting. But really, your life is more important than any property you may leave behind. So I strongly urge people to not be in the path. You know, you hear from people that evacuated and maybe wish they hadn't, but you don't hear from people that stayed and wish they hadn't, because many of them are no longer around.
Certainly important to remember. Thank you so much. Bob Henson there, meteorologist and climate writer for the Weather Company and the owner of weather.com and Weather Underground.